You know, the phrase women in Islam, it brings up some pretty powerful images, right? And with them, some really strong opinions. But have you ever stopped to ask, where do those images actually come from? Are they rooted in the religion's core texts, or is something else going on? Well, in this explainer, we're going to dig into the scripture and the history to find out. Let's get into it.
Seriously, take a second. When you hear those three words, what is the very first thing that pops into your head? Because for a lot of people, especially in the West, that image often looks something like this.
Confined, powerless, oppressed. Yeah, it's a narrative we see pretty much everywhere, in the headlines, on TV. But here's the big question we really need to ask. Does this picture come from the actual pages of Scripture, or is it a reflection of something else? That's what we're here to figure out.
So, to get to the bottom of this, we're going to go on a bit of a journey. First, we'll jump back in time to see what the world was like before Islam even entered the picture. Then, we'll dive right into the scriptures themselves to see what rights were laid out. We'll look at the incredible status given to mothers, and finally, we'll try to untangle that tricky knot of religion versus tradition. Okay, let's start by rewinding the clock. Because, to really understand any revolutionary idea, you first have to understand the world it was born into. And for Islam, that world was 7th century Arabia. The time before Islam is called the Jahiliyat, which basically means the age of ignorance. And during this period, having a daughter wasn't a celebration at all. It was actually seen as a source of shame, a total humiliation. Then, boom, in the 7th century, Islam appears, and it introduces a radically different way of thinking that directly attacks these old norms. And this isn't just something historians figured out later. It's described in vivid detail right in the Quran. This verse just captures that awful reality, a father's face physically darkening with shame and grief just from hearing he had a daughter. In some tribes, it got so bad it led to the horrific practice of burying baby girls alive. So the very first thing Islam did regarding women was to secure their most fundamental right, the right to simply exist. And it went so much further than just banning a terrible practice. It completely flipped the script on the idea of a daughter, transforming her from a source of shame into a rahmah, a blessing, a mercy from God. Okay, so if the right to life was the massive first step, what came next? How did this build into a real framework of rights? Well, let's look at the specific rights given to women in Islam's foundational text all the way back 1,400 years ago. All right, let's just bust a huge myth right out of the gate. This idea that Islam holds women back from education. A central teaching from the Prophet makes seeking knowledge a duty for every single Muslim, and the Arabic word used is explicitly gender inclusive. There's no gray area. And this wasn't just a nice thought. The Prophet's own wife, Aisha, became one of the most brilliant and influential scholars in Islamic history. I mean, we're talking about a legal expert and teacher who the top male leaders of the time would go to for advice.
Okay, what about marriage? Islamic law is crystal clear on this. If a woman doesn't give her full consent, the marriage is invalid. Period. There's this powerful real-life example where a woman went straight to the Prophet and said, "My father forced me to marry." His response? He immediately gave her the power to cancel the marriage right then and there. This is a huge statement on female agency. And on top of that, you have the Mahr, the bridal gift. This isn't a dowry her family pays. It's a mandatory gift from the groom directly to the bride. And it becomes her own independent property. She can do whatever she wants with it.
Now, check this out. Just wrap your head around this timeline for a second. In the 7th century, Islamic law gave women the full independent right to own, inherit, and manage their own money and property. Her wealth was hers, untouchable. Now compare that to the West. It wasn't until the late 1800s, more than 1,200 years later, that laws even began to change systems like coverture, where a married woman basically had no independent financial rights at all. And this right to property wasn't just some vague suggestion. It was written down as divine law. This verse from the Quran states it plainly. When it comes to inheritance, men get a share and women get a share. This was absolutely revolutionary in a world where pretty much everything was just passed down from father to son. So we've covered legal and economic rights, but Islam also places this incredible emphasis on a woman's right to dignity and respect. And nowhere is that clearer than in the status it gives to mothers. And this all goes back to a really famous story. A man came to the Prophet Muhammad to ask a simple but really profound question. Basically, who in his life deserved the absolute best from him? So the man asks, "Who has the greatest right to my kindness?" The Prophet's answer was instant. "Your mother."
The man, probably a little surprised, asks again. Okay, and who's next? Again, the answer was your mother. He pushes a third time, and then who? For a third time, the Prophet says, your mother. It was only after he asked a fourth time that he finally got a different answer. Then, your father.
I mean, the message here is just stunning, and you can't miss it. The status, the honor, the kindness you owe to your mother is 3 times greater than what you owe to your father. It's an incredible elevation of the role of a mother to the very top of human relationships.
This whole concept is perfectly captured in one of the most famous prophetic sayings, one that is echoed through Muslim cultures for centuries, that your ultimate reward, paradise itself, is tied directly to how you treat your mother.
So all of this brings us to the big, critical question. If all of these rights are so clearly spelled out in the core texts, why is there such a massive gap between these ideals and the reality we see in some places today?
It's the elephant in the room, isn't it? We've just walked through all the scriptural evidence for rights to life, education, consent, property, and incredible honor. So why does the actual experience for so many women in some Muslim-majority countries seem like the complete opposite? Well, the answer seems to lie in a critical distinction that we almost always forget to make: the difference between religion and culture. It is so important to separate the divine principles you find in a holy book from the man-made, local traditions of a society. They are just not the same thing.
And here's the argument. Many of the oppressive things we see, like denying girls an education or forcing them into marriage, they aren't actually coming from Islamic teachings. Instead, they come from deep-seated, local, patriarchal traditions that were around long before Islam, or have grown over the centuries, and now they just wear the mask of religion. And that leaves us with one final thought. When we evaluate any ideology, any philosophy, any religion, what's the fairest way to do it? Do we judge it by its original source code, its foundational texts? Or do we judge it by the flawed and sometimes contradictory actions of the human beings who say they follow it? That's a question worth thinking about.